everybody. This is T. Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're continuing our discussion on the 11 nations as proposed by Colin Woodard's book. And what we are doing is not only talking about the sorts of highlights that are covered in his book, but I'm very curious to understand the tension management aspects of it. So what prompted these different cultures to come to the United States originally? Where were they on the change grid? Once they got here, how did they move around on the change grid? How do conflicts get explained based on the change grid? So never make any mistake about it. We're always going to see what we can do to better understand whatever it is we're looking at through this lens of tension management. So that's what we're doing. Now, last time around, we did talk about, I think about the first half or so of these. We talked about First Nations, which were the original indigenous populations. Up in Canada, they continue to be referred to as First Nations. Here we refer to them as Native Americans. El Norte would have been down in the northern part of Mexico. This was part of Spain's colonial empire. And so a lot of that spilled into what is now the United States, or probably more accurately, what is now the United States imposed itself on what was El Norte at that point in time. And those of you who haven't visited southernmost California or southern Arizona or New Mexico or southwestern Texas, all the way down to Galveston, you would not be at all surprised to see that there is a great deal of that whole Spanish Mexican kind of influence here today. Half of our streets have Spanish names, so it's all part of it. Well, then people started coming, and New France was among the very earliest. They came mostly to the northernmost United States. In fact, barely little parts of perhaps Vermont, Maine, and in fact, to this day, English is not the primary language spoken in northernmost Maine. It's French. And so this area of Canada is Quebec and Montreal, and so there's lots of French-speaking areas here. For reasons that we briefly spoke about, the second area that New France positioned itself was down around Louisiana. And there's a lot of French-related sorts of things down here in Louisiana. The thought is that it's because of trading routes and moving materials down the Mississippi River, ultimately coming down to that whole Delta area down here in Louisiana. So I don't think there was any particular reason why the French wanted Louisiana otherwise, but there it is. By the way, even Louisiana is a French word, French name. Okay, then we talked a little bit about Yankeedom. Now, these were the people who started sending over the early settlers, the Mayflower, all that sort of started coming to this northernmost area of the country. They were looking for religious freedom. Well, what they were really trying to do is create their own religious enclave where you could be as free as you wanted to be as long as you practice their religion. So they wanted freedom from somebody else. So, we look at the tension management kinds of things. New France was coming because of opportunities to trade. So a little bit more power stress, looking for opportunities and doing their best. Obviously, at a certain point in time, things evolved, got out of control. I do not know the history of Canada to know when did Canada become part of the UK? Did it start off that way? I genuinely don't know the history of Canada. And you'd think I would growing up in, a border of the US and Canada. You'd think we'd had a little bit of that education, but we did not. So anyway, but they came from that kind of let's create business, let's create opportunity, let's create trade and all that. So that's a very different mindset than the people who came from Yankeedom, wanting to escape whatever the persecution was they were experiencing in Europe and come over to the U.S. where they could have that religious freedom as well. Now, obviously, they interacted with the indigenous populations there, and things became very contentious. And for a while, it looked like they might be able to work things out, but there was plenty of tension management that was going on, and imposing beliefs and cultural norms and all that kind of stuff was going on. And then New Netherlands was the next. And by the way, Yankeedom ultimately spread all the way across to now Minnesota and even getting a bit into the eastern edges of the Dakotas. Um, so anyway, next it was New Netherlands. New Netherlands were the Dutch who basically came here for the reasons why the Dutch go everywhere, and that was to establish trade routes. And so they had very little, if any, interest in our politics or in our religious beliefs or in any of whatever was going on. They just wanted to create a way to move goods in and out of that area of New York and New Jersey and other areas around that where they could get into a protected port and do whatever it is that needed to be done to establish those good trade routes. Um, and then we start talking a little bit about the Midlands. The Midlands kind of, I don't think, started, and Kathy, you might know better than I do. Linda, you've also read the book, maybe you know, but did the Quakers come to the US independent of the Yankees, or did they all come over as part of like the Yankee movement and said, oh no, enough of this puritanical nonsense. Let's scoot a little bit south and create our own
It was a
Midlands.
little bit of both, T. They also came through Amsterdam. I mean, they came through the Netherlands
Yep. Yep.
as well. From what I remember now, so there was a little bit of both. I think they hitchhiked a bit
hmm
on the Puritans, but for the most part, they were their own movement.
Okay, all right. So some came independently. Others kind of broke off, or moved a little further south. And again, as we talked about on Tuesday, this is where you'll find perhaps more of the Mennonite, Amish, some of those other sorts of things. But I do believe Quakers and Shakers were still up in New England primarily, right? Northern New York and all that
Not
for
not really.
so
I think
much.
they came more through um, because they came through the Netherlands. They probably
Right,
came through into more of the New York area and
right,
migrated out from there. So they migrated out to Pennsylvania, to more northern New York, where they could be who they were. They came down further south to to the Maryland area, whatever, New Jersey.
yep,
But
yep, yep, yep.
but um, but yeah, I
And
think
then
their primary entry point was New York. Although I have friends whose family um, were Quakers from the Revolutionary War,
mhm.
and they are all settled in Massachusetts. So people have come through Boston and New York mostly as
Yeah, yeah.
Quaker populations.
Yeah, and it's very interesting too because as they started to migrate further west, you get over to Ohio. I believe that the Mormon Church had its start in Ohio, and then because it was persecuted, moved all the way out to Utah. But so a lot of this
Actually, it started further east. It
did
it
it.
started. Yeah. I just read about that. It started I think it might have even started in New England.
Interesting.
Um, uh, I mean, Joseph Smith, I think,
Right.
started in New England and then moved all the way west. So, yeah.
hmm Because I know maybe they were trying to establish themselves in Ohio. It wasn't all that successful, and then they finally said, like, well, we're moving, we're moving. Yeah. Um, so now then I just wanted to bring one thing to your all of your attention, and that is the people that are in Yankeedom, the people that are in the Midlands. These are people, these are people who had a very different philosophy about indentured servitude and slavery compared to some of the other ones we're going to be looking at. So certainly the people in the Midlands were very much anti-slavery, Yankeedom, anti-slavery, um, and didn't even have that whole aristocratic idea of people being indentured servants or this whole idea about the aristocrats would be the superiors and the people who work for them were in a certain locked into a certain lot in life from which they would never really escape.
No,
And that's it.
I'm
Yep.
sorry. I'm sorry, T. That's not true.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
They all believed in indenturedness. I mean, they all came over from Europe with that sense of indenturedness, where whoever was on lowest on the totem pole, whether it was the Highland Scot whether it was the Irish, whether it was, you know, minorities, whatever. I mean, all of that existed in all of those areas. The difference was that they didn't build it into their economy in as big a way. But indenture was
Oh, hmm.
in, you know, the way the South did, because it was an agricultural thing. But in the North, there was all kinds of indentured servants that existed through way into the 20th century.
And,
Um,
and was that in part started because people needed to pay for their passage to the
yeah,
New World?
yep, yep. And
Okay.
they needed cheap labor. So aristocrats always had indentured servants in Boston and New York and all these places. And there were
Yeah.
slaves throughout New England too. I mean, we have, you know, evidence of slave, but it was in spots. It wasn't like the degree to which you see it as you move further south.
Right, right. See,
So
that
does
was,
this play into the what is that I used to hear all the time? The Mason-Dixon line or something like that. There was these cotton growers down south.
yeah, that's the deep South. This is the world of cotton right
Okay.
here. That's cotton.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the Mason-Dixon line, I've never really seen. It doesn't follow a state line so much, but it goes across that. And they said anything above the Mason-Dixon line, you were part of the North, and south of the Mason-Dixon line, you were part of the
Does
South.
that refer to like that mid area? Like I think someone told me before, like I asked a question, I remember it wasn't on the citizenry test, but like the South, like where does it start? Because like Maryland, you know, this DC, Maryland, Virginia area, they call the DMV. Maryland isn't South, right? Virginia starts the South. Is that correct?
Maryland is the demarcation for the Mason-Dixon line.
In fact,
Maryland was considered south. So you go below New Jersey and go into Maryland and go out of Delaware and into Maryland. And that's the beginning of the Mason-Dixon line on the East Coast.
in fact, there you
Okay.
go. That's the Mason-Dixon line. And so, right, so Delaware would have been part of the North, but Maryland would have been part of is south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah, yeah,
And then West Virginia. So then it does follow state lines, all of Kentucky.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Very, very clearly follow state lines.
Yeah, state lines. And then is this
Wow.
Missouri? I think this is Missouri.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then it didn't go any further west because I don't think there was all that much west yet. So
No, it went up to the
Interesting.
Mississippi, you know, after
yeah, to the Mississippi River, and then yeah. Yep.
Very
So
interesting.
yeah, so yeah, a lot of these West Virginia, Kentucky, all this would have been part of the South. Although I'll tell you that during the Civil War, North Carolina had certain pockets of great safety because people from the Deep South, aristocrats from the Deep South, would send particularly their daughters, to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And there was a community of, I'll tell you what they are, just one second. No, not Mennonites, Moravians. And the Moravians started a college specifically for young women called Salem College. And for whatever reason, that was a very protected sort of a spot. Most of the loss of life was further south than that, although, you know, Charlotte and all that certainly had their issue. By the way, Charlotte is kind of like right here where I'm squiggling around right now.
Interesting.
Yeah. So several states really didn't suffer all that much in the Civil War because, you know, they might have sent people to it, but that's not where the battles were fought so much. But get over here in Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina. Yeah.
So what is that big state next to? Is that New Jersey? That big square? Yeah, this right. Yeah.
This right here is
What
New
is that?
Jersey. This is New
So what
Jersey.
is that state next to it?
This one over here? Or this one here?
The big one,
That's
right?
that's Pennsylvania.
Oh,
That's
okay, okay.
Pennsylvania. Then this is New Jersey. This is Delaware. This is Maryland. Maryland is a very strange shape.
It is.
Well, because look right here where I don't know if there's enough room. Can you actually drive to this little piece of West Virginia or of Maryland without going through Virginia, or rather West Virginia, or that? I've never driven that, so I don't know if it's.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, it's very narrow by the looks of things. So Yeah, it makes you wonder why didn't West Virginia just gobble that up? Historically, I'm
I
sure there's a reason.
discovered a small town in Western Maryland called Sykesville.
Oh,
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I necessarily want to go there, but it
yeah.
does have my name.
You might want to know
Oh,
the history.
yeah, that you should investigate that, because there are a lot of little towns that were, that have really fascinating histories that would surprise you. So I would check it out if I were you.
Yeah, why
Yeah,
not? I mean, it'd be
yeah.
very interesting for you to find out. I mean, Sykes is, I don't know how common a name of it is, but you do hear it often. And so I think there's a lot of different Sykes
Yes.
families that are out there, but I don't know where the name originated. When did you take
Originated
the name
it,
of Sykes?
from what I understand, it originated in Europe or something like. I did a DNA test, and they said that the Sykes tend to originate near marshes or something like that in Eastern Europe. And I
Hmm,
said, okay. Um,
hmm.
and then it migrated to like Africa and different places. But they said it's the Sykes the name tend to originate around different beds of water and marshes and stuff like that. And I was always
Yeah.
that was
Well, in
curious
fact,
for
here you
me
go.
because
Yeah.
I love water.
Right. So Sykes name and meaning. This is from ancestry.com. English, mainly Yorkshire. Topographic name for someone who lived by a stream in a marsh or in a hollow. From the Middle
Exactly.
English syke, meaning marshy stream or damp gully. Or it's a
Exactly.
or it's a habitational name from one of the places named with this word in Lancashire and West Yorkshire.
Yeah.
So isn't that in? No, but mind you, that's Sykes, Sikes.
Right, right.
So
Then they
well,
took on Sykes
yeah. But you,
later on.
we told you we researched you because we knew you had connections to the Caribbean, and we found that there is in fact a Brian Sykes who is one of the chief justices of the Supreme Court of one of the Caribbean nations. Was it
In
Jamaica?
Jamaica,
Yeah, there you
yes,
go.
in
And I
Jamaica.
thought, like, is his
Exactly.
dad a chief justice?
Exactly.
So there you go. All
And there's a
right.
Professor Brian
From
Sykes that
linguistics.
actually writes about DNA. He's probably 70 years old now from the United Kingdom. And I met him because he did my DNA test. And
Hmm.
he spells his name exactly the same. And he goes around telling all these corporate American CEOs, you're all from Africa, and they just stand there, look dumbfounded for
Yeah,
it. It's just called.
but you are. So there you go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now. Again, we always want to get back to this whole tension management sorts of things. So I think that there's a difference between coming to a new place because where you were was not really supporting you in whatever way, and coming because you wanted to take over something.
Mm,
So, and
mhm.
I think as we start talking about some of these others, we can feel a little bit more of that energy. Now, again, Kathy is our resident cultural anthropologist, so she can give us a lot more of the specific details around this. But when we look at Tidewater, now Tidewater is the eastern part of Virginia and North Carolina. And I'm sure it talks about if it's into Delaware. I don't know what's all being overlapped there. But English gentry created estates in Virginia using indentured servitude, but they switched to slavery when the indentured servitude system degraded. So I think that what that means is that if you're an indentured servant, one way or another, you were purchasing your freedom. You were getting out from under that contract. And the assumption, even going into the contract, was that you intended at some point in time to buy your way out of it. I'm sure that made a lot of the people who held you as an indentured servant very unhappy. But nevertheless, that was part of the system. And so when that system started to fall apart, then slavery started to come into the picture. So Kathy, is that correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think indentured servitude stopped being profitable. I
Hmm.
mean, it's plain and simple, dollars and cents.
Yeah, yeah.
Indentured servitude stopped being as profitable. as there were opportunities, because there were all kinds of ways that people kept people indentured, whether they were following the rules or not.
Right,
But
right.
what happened was, as slavery came in from, don't forget, South Carolina, Charleston was one of the biggest ports
That's
for
right.
slavery.
That's right. That's
And
where
as
they entered.
slaves, as more and more slaves came into the United States, it just simply became more profitable to own people
Yeah.
rather than, so you probably had indentured servitude becoming that whole class of sharecroppers, and poor whites who
Yep. Yep.
started populating the South
That's right.
in that way. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And part of what was
Interesting.
driving that is where the economy of the South actually came from. Like they're talking about here about now we move into from the Tidewater into the deep South. English traders from Barbados, where they acquired resources using violence and slavery. In Charleston, they grew cotton in a society designed to benefit a wealthy few. And so you have all that. Well, cotton is a profoundly labor intensive crop.
Mhm.
And it had not, there very little automation had happened yet until the cotton gin was invented and all that. All this had to be picked by hand. It had to be sorted by hand. It had to be de-seeded, whatever all the little steps are that were involved there. And without slavery, it probably would have been cost prohibitive to have even begun to start growing such things. Other things were growing down there as well. Tobacco is a big crop in the South.
Mhm.
And at a certain point in time, camellias came into the United States. And so Lynn and I know a lot about the whole world of camellia. Those of you who know camellia as the flower. Well, the camellias, the flower, are Camellia japonica. So it's a Japanese version of the camellia that are grown almost exclusively for flowers. Well, there was a bunch of plantations in South Carolina who wanted to start growing tea as a crop because this area is very well suited for growing tea as well. That plant is the Camellia chinensis, a Chinese camellia. Unbeknownst to the people who brought in these plants and brought in, I'm talking about plantations full of them, they had mistakenly brought in Camellia japonica instead of chinensis and ended up with a whole lot of flowers and nothing that was drinkable as far as tea goes. And because of that, anyone who buys a camellia, a flowering camellia, anywhere in the United States, that plant genetically goes all the way back to that original mistake that was made at a plantation in South Carolina.
Wow.
Sooner or later, they did get the right varieties, and there is a bit of a tea sort of industry that's down in that area as well, but never what they had fantasized it could become. They thought it'd be one of the major crops in the South.
And isn't the tobacco still a major industry stronghold in the
Absolutely.
South
In
now?
the Virginias, in Kentucky, Tennessee, points further south. I think at a certain point in time, it becomes too warm for tobacco to grow. Tobacco, the plant is Nicotiana, and it requires a proper winter in order for its whole cycle to do what it needs to do. So at a certain point, it gets a little bit too warm for proper winter to actually come along. But yeah, this whole area here, you'd find tobacco. Certainly you'd find cotton further south. Cotton likes it a lot hotter, a lot drier.
And see, I begin to wonder, like, we're talking about these attitudes and tension. I begin to wonder how much of that particular industry with that kind of stronghold, like there's just been this transfer from generation to generation of some of these precepts and attitudes and different things like that. Kind of like in South Africa, you have the diamond mining is like a
Yeah,
cartel.
that's
It's
right.
a
Yeah.
coveted position. So your family knows someone, your family, your family. So I wonder how much of that attitude plays out in the South in terms of how they see people, how they deal with people,
Oh,
because they
yeah.
seem to have a significant stronghold. Like they're almost like the NRA kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like it has
no.
that kind of
No, it
that
continues to
feeling.
this day. And Kathy again can tell us a lot more about the anthropological parts of it. But the Deep South continues to this day to practice a lot of the traditions that would have
Mm,
come over with Tidewater or with these aristocratic settlers. They still have cotillion balls. They still have a season, a social season for the daughters of the wealthy to be able to find a proper suitor and all that. That also happens in the north as well. But I mean, it's a big, big deal. Even as
mm,
far west as Texas, where the dresses and hair get a lot bigger, but nevertheless, it's still the whole sort of genteel South.
mm.
The big gowns and the big that continues to this day. Cotillions and whatever else they're all referred to as. Kathy, can you speak a little
Oh,
bit to that?
absolutely. This is entrenched social structure. I mean, this is totally entrenched. I mean, to go back to the Barbados were the most brutal
Yeah,
of the slave, basically the slave
mhm,
traders,
that's right.
and because of the sugar plantations.
Yeah.
Mm,
The sugar plantations were the most brutal and the deepest south
Mhm.
of the, it's not just cotton, the sugar plantations were,
Yep.
and they continue to this day to bring in, I mean, I did a lot of field work and research in Belglade, Florida, where they used migrant labor, and I studied the migrant labor there from Haiti and from other places where
Yep.
they were essentially slaves
Mhm.
brought in and managed it through the 60s, 70s, and 80s of this country.
Yep. Yep.
So there's a brutality about that that comes from the Caribbean, but there was rice, there was
Mhm.
sugar, the sugar plantations, and then cotton was a little bit further north. But
Yep.
but
Cotton
those
here.
were the and so there were whole culture, I mean, whole social structures built on.
That's right. And keep in mind that it's not the population of the United States who needed all those crops. These were for export in large part. So all that
mm.
tobacco that was being raised was being, taken back to Europe, and a lot of the sugar cane, a lot of the cotton. This is all for export. But these were all extremely labor intensive agricultural um, undertakings. And
Interesting.
and honestly,
Wow.
if it had not been for slave labor, these agricultural successes, if you will, would have had no chance of really happening.
I mean, if you think about it, the United States was the third world country of Europe. Okay, if you think about it that way.
Yeah,
So they were the source of resource. They were the resource base, gold, um,
furs up here,
furs,
gold. Yep.
crops, just raw materials, all of that. That was the point of conquering America, of coming to the United States. And so the point was to just take as much as possible, formulate it, and ship it back to Europe. And then what happened was parts of North America, peoples in North America eventually formed their own and strength in their own organizations, their own cultures, but they also duplicated a lot of what the Europeans did. So
Right.
they carried that model forward.
Right.
But think about the United States as as raw resources, the same way people treat Africa now.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
how, Brian, if you can relate to how the Europeans and the world has treated Africa as a source of resources, whether it's oil, whether it's
Hmm.
mining, whether it's that's how North America was seen by the Europeans.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
that's what our history is, and how things shifted, how things shifted.
Yeah, now talking about the whole idea about South Carolina and the slave trade entering there, and that there's in Charleston, South Carolina. Um, yeah, Charleston. Let me make sure that's Charleston. Yep. Wait a second. Savannah, Georgia, a little bit
Hmm.
further south. Charleston and Savannah are pretty close to each other. There's a restaurant called the Pirate House, and it has been in existence since pirate times. So pirates,
Wow.
it's always been in operation. It's a little bit of an inn, mostly now. It's a restaurant. They insist that it's haunted and all this sort of a thing. But there was a whole lot of hard living that came along there. A lot of stuff that was, above the law, if you will.
Mhm.
So yeah, this was a dangerous place. And again, you're right next to the Caribbean. So this is all of those piracy routes. So how many of those ships that were traveling to Europe ended up being impacted? So my point is that the level of productive tension that existed from tidewater over to the deep south, et cetera, this is a very different energy than
Mhm.
we encountered when we look at the tension management of the people there up there. I would say, and Kathy, you can certainly tell me if this is true or not, but as far as having any real regard for the native populations, as you move further south and later in the timeline, there became less and less regard for the people who were already there and what they had going on. And that's not to suggest there was a lot of regard to begin with in the northern areas, but colonization began up here in the north.
No, absolutely. It was just genocide. It was
It was
the whole
genocide.
point was to take the land. The whole
Take the
point
land.
was that was our philosophy, the manifest destiny
Yep.
and reaching the West Coast. And it was all about land ownership and moving further. And the Indians were just in the way.
Yep.
And so genocide became, I mean, I hate to sound so brutal about it, but I mean, I've studied this for a long time. There doesn't seem to be any other kind of way of interpreting it other than they were simply in the way and needed to be gotten either
Right.
retrained, but or literally physically moved. You know, stories
Yeah.
like the Trail of Tears, the
Right.
Cherokees that were forced to walk from uh, from North
From
Carolina
and yeah,
to to
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's pretty. It's we have a brutal history. We
We have a
really do.
very brutal history. Now that gets us now then into the discussion about the next one, which was Greater Appalachia, because I think the Greater Appalachia story is a bit different than the Deep South. What was driving Greater Appalachia, if we read here, these were mostly lowland contrarians from Scotland and Ireland. So they came to escape English domination. So there was a whole group of people in Scotland and Ireland who were just plain fed up with the way the English were treating them. And there were these mass exodi of people from Ireland. And I don't know when they would say the date range for the diaspora would be, but do you know, Kathy, what the
I
time?
do. I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've studied this. The first of all, the Highland Scots, which live in North Carolina and a lot of Appalachia, and the Irish were basically forced out. You know, either through starvation or
Yeah.
through what Britain did was it basically sent colonies of what they called criminals or people who were upsurgents, resurgents out and sent them, got rid of them, banished them to the U.S. And so a lot of these people had already suffered genocide in the British Isles. And so when they came here, it was like, you know, let's get out of Dodge. You know, we're still indentured. So they came as indentured servants. And so their history was still one of oppression. And so their escape into Appalachia was, we have to make our own rules or we're not going to survive. They're total survivalists, you know,
That's
where
right.
there's no way around it.
That's
And
right.
that happened during the most of it happened during the 1700s with the battle in Britain, where they basically destroyed the clans and got rid of
Yes.
all the clans in Highland Scotland. And so that was around the 1700s. So when the country was forming, they tried to engage some of these people in the wars. They tried, and then they tended to stay out of it as much as possible and form their own enclave.
And
So that
one thing that really helped them do that, and I don't know if all of you have visited this area of the country, but this area of the country is very hilly, if not mountainous, heavily forested, not for the weak-hearted. And so there was lots of little nooks and crannies, little valleys and caves that you could disappear into, and the government would never find you.
Mm.
So, in fact, Mammoth Cave National Park, which continues to be thought of as the largest cave system ever found on the planet, is right there in Kentucky. And when you think about all the little valleys and rivers and coal mines and all that, that's all here. This is an area that, until coal came along, people probably didn't think there was all that much to be interested in. And so fine, you sent all these ne'er-do-wells there who didn't like the government to begin with, and they just really wanted to just be left alone. And that continues to this day to be very characteristic of people from this particular area, the Appalachian region. Just kind of leave them alone. They want individual liberty, and they have no real, they don't feel like they owe anything to anybody. And my family is from there, so I was kind of raised with this as part of like a little bit of a mindset to all that. It's just kind of don't trust anybody, never trust the government, don't trust people from the deep south, don't trust people from up here, the industrial. Just trust only the people that you know, and it's all based on family ties and bloodlines and things like that. There's a tremendous amount of poverty in this area. The level of education, generally speaking, is not particularly high. Even the availability of common comforts are still not necessarily found. Like if you went to visit my family in Yerkes and Hazard, Kentucky, you would be shocked to find out that I still have family who have an outhouse instead of running water and plumbing inside of their own home. And so there's still that exists there, houses with dirt floors, things like that. And by the way, the people, it's not like they feel like they're they're suffering. Um, they for them it's just a normal way of living. And
Hmm.
yeah, yep,
There's,
yep.
there's an
Some of
interesting,
those cultural values are still there,
Oh
like
yes.
the horse farming and horse
Now
breeding.
yeah, now that's westernmost Kentucky. There's
Yeah.
yeah, in Tennessee, yeah, there's where the wealth is.
My
I was
home in Ocala, Florida is second to, or at least they say is second to Kentucky in horse breeding.
Yep, yep.
And that industry always keep other industries out. Like there's another Sykes in Tampa who wanted to build, he has the largest call center in the world, and he wanted to build, when I was on the Economic Development Council in Ocala, he wanted to build like a Yankee Stadium, summer league, summer training, and
Mm-hmm.
he wanted to build other things. And the horse farming industry, with their stronghold, said, "No, we don't
Mm-mm.
want to bring that in."
No. It's
Yeah,
I promise you, it's a different social scene. Um, Equestrian lifestyles are very different than the baseball lifestyle or other lifestyles
yeah.
you might see elsewhere. Yeah, it's a very expensive hobby. It's a very expensive thing to do, but that's westernmost Kentucky. And Tennessee, et cetera. Okay, so anyway, this is an interesting thing. Now, I want to talk about a couple of migratory little things that happen so you guys can see as well. One of the primary industries in this little greater Appalachian area. And by the way, it's interesting. If you look at the Appalachian Mountains and you talk to someone who is from the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains, even the eastern slopes, they refer to the area as Appalachia. Where if you look at people that are on the west or the northwestern sides of things, which is mostly that's where it's definitely Appalachia. So they even say it differently. As you look at the mountain range. Well, coal mining was a very big industry in this particular area. And back in the 1950s, maybe 1940s, as things were becoming increasingly industrialized up in Michigan, specifically, Ohio as well, Pennsylvania, so the auto manufacturers, the steel industry, et cetera, they needed laborers. And where they got a lot of those laborers was by going down to Greater Appalachia and aggressively recruiting men out of the mines. and then move them up there. My family ended up in Michigan because my dad, who was a coal miner, was recruited to come up to Ypsilanti, Michigan, also nicknamed Ypsi-Tucky, Michigan, when General Motors opened up the hydromatic plant. And so that was it. So there was a very large concentration of people in this particular area, probably all around this area, that have their roots in Appalachia, that have those Scotch-Irish kind of bloodlines, but they were brought up because of opportunities that the industries here led to be. Back in those days, it was possible to have one of these rags to riches stories. So my dad, again, went from being a coal miner. When he was brought up to the hydromatic plant, he started off sweeping floors. And when my dad retired, he was the head of labor relations for Fisher Body Division of General Motors. So
Wow.
yeah, you could really advance. There was a lot of good opportunity, but it was because of that migration that you see. Kathy, any comments about the northern migration from?
Yeah, no, it's all fascinating. When I was one of my mentors, in college and graduate school, is a woman named Carol Stack, who wrote a book called All My Kin about Black kinship uh, communities in throughout the Midwest, but she also wrote the history of the migration south, the great migration up from the south of also of Black people, and it's very similar to what your family talked about. The difference was that the opportunities for upward mobility were fewer. But as slaves were freed and as they looked for opportunity, they started also in the middle part of the early part of the century in the 20s and 30s and 40s to move up into Michigan to the Detroit,
Yes,
and that area,
absolutely.
which is why you have such a large Black population in those cities, because they were part of that migration up. Then they started migrating back in the last 15, 20 years. There's been a huge migration back to the South from those people. But absolutely, what you describe is a recruiting of people who could again serve a new level. If you think about our spiral dynamics concept,
Yes, yes.
so the spiral dynamics, as technology increases and you're moving away from coal mining and then moving into a higher level of technology, you're moving the labor force up into
Yes.
those new opportunities,
Right. With a
and in creating new enclaves.
Right. So yeah, because they were given the promise of a greater future, the
Yeah,
promise of the American dream, all these things pulling them further and further. And going back to slavery, even before slavery was abolished, this was the route of the Underground Railroad.
yeah,
Bring people up to the north where they could be, um, well, a little bit more protected if someone came after them, but a lot
yeah,
of them also crossed over into Canada.
yeah,
And Detroit is probably one of the spots where Canada is physically closest to the United States, right here where southernmost Ontario butts right up against Michigan. The only thing that separates is the Detroit River. And so you
You,
cross the river and you're
Wow.
there. Yeah.
I was just going to add, being from Wisconsin,
Hmm.
I don't know if a lot of people know, but La Follette at the turn of the century was a proclaimed socialist. And so that's where Wisconsin, it's always had one of the best welfare programs until
Hmm.
there was
Hmm.
reform.
Yeah.
But there were two mayors, Mayor Meyer, and who was the other one? 28 years each in Milwaukee. They literally posted signs in Mississippi and Alabama saying, "Come to the land of milk and honey." So there was a
That's
very
right.
active campaign with billboards bringing the blacks up. Yep.
Yeah, because the labor force, the industry needed the labor. And
Yep.
Wisconsin was, of course, a big dairy state, but it also had very industrialized city. Madison and Milwaukee. Well, Milwaukee probably was one of the biggest brewing locations there, but there was also a steel industry there.
Big. A
Yeah,
harnish bager, the crane industry. Yeah, there's a
right.
ton of manufacturing there. Yep.
Yeah, now the other thing that was happening, talking about instead of talking about northern migration, let's talk about western migration, because you see that all these different nations seem to stretch. Well, they didn't start off stretching that far to the west. There were some things that were happening in the US in general. There were a couple of land rushes where basically the federal government was saying, hey, any of you, anybody who is willing to traipse off to points further west can stake a claim on land. And once you stake the claim, that land is yours. And so it was this big promise of land ownership. And now you could have your plantations, your life, your whatever. That's my dentist. So a lot of that was going on. And I think, Linda, if you want to unmute, didn't some of your relatives end up going west in the land rush? I don't know if she's still
Oh,
there.
I am unmuted already. Huh, didn't even know that.
Yeah, there.
I was going to ask Kathy, what years did the land rush start?
Well, I mean, they started probably in the 1800s, the early 1800s, and then continued when gold in the 1849, you know?
Right. The gold rush.
1849, the gold rush, but it was the early 1800s when people were crossing the Mississippi and moving west. You know, of course, there was the little detail of you know, the Native Americans who
Yes.
happened to be living there while we were giving their land away and inviting people to move across. So that was when, during, you know, was it Andrew Jackson, basically his campaign of making sure that all the Indian wars, the Indians were being destroyed as we moved west. But it was around the 1800s and not shortly after not long after the Revolution, when that started.
I was going to say there's a story within my family that my great grandmother on my mother's side was part of the land rush. So, but isn't that something you want to wish your grandma was still alive so you could ask her about her grandma?
Yeah.
You know?
What's the real story? What's the real story?
I'd love to know more about that story now that I'm older.
Because there's even a
yeah.
picture of this gal holding a big rifle, right, dear? And
Oh, that's my grandma, though. My grandma, when my grandfather married her and took her up into the Upper Peninsula, here she was, you know, from the Detroit area at Royal Oak, and she had to learn to hunt to feed the kids. She had to learn how to do all the fishing. She had to learn all that stuff. So that was my grandma holding that rifle. And I've got a picture of me now holding that rifle because my cousin, when we went to visit him in the Upper Peninsula, he still had it. And so that's there's quite a lot of history in the Upper Peninsula with my family that I do know about.
Wow.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so I think that we want to say, like, while these cultures might have continued, from a tension management perspective, there was another energy, because now they were saying, hey, all of you people who are part of whatever slice of the country you're part of, there is opportunity if you head west. And there were other reasons why people headed west too, for religious freedom, for whatever, but they were heading west for some opportunity, because this was not for the timid. So a particularly sturdy slice of each one of these other groups took it upon themselves to say, I'll head west, I'll head west. And so now you look about wagon trains and on. And, you know, then someone certainly realized, oh, there's a gigantic mountain range there that we have to deal with. You know, who knows what all they encountered, plus the indigenous populations, on and on and on. Well, I
And
bring
another
that up.
really interesting thing is if you look at the map of the states who gave women the vote and when it happened, the West is like solid. Very first people to give women the vote because they knew that women could do exactly what a man could do. So
Yeah.
all the states in the West were giving women the votes way back in the 1800s.
Yeah.
That's
Talk,
great.
Yeah, talk about equality, at least at the household level,
Yeah.
because, people were out there building their little homesteads. So while some might have had jobs, there were certainly some stores and things like that. There wasn't any really formal industry quite yet that was there. And so you got to believe women were definitely viewed as being an equal partner in all that. And even though they were viewed as an equal partner, guess who still had to raise the kids? And
Mhm.
lots of kids were being born and all that kind of glow. Well, I bring that up just to say the far west, explorers, hunters, and adventurers were joined. So those were the original ones. We had explorers, we had hunters. Those were the early ones out there looking around. This all had to be scouted, of course. Um, and then the adventurers decided, because of the land rush, or even before the land rush, they were going to go and see what was out there. Um, Off they went. Well, then you ended up by these East Coast anti-government capitalists and industrialists. And they started to put in place the railroad lines because they went like, hey, there's a lot of lumber out here. There's a lot of mining opportunities out here. There's a lot of other things that we could actually bring back to this more developed, more populated eastern side of the United States. And
There is a name for that concept, and it's called internal colonialism.
ooh,
And
Mm.
there's a whole book written about this that I studied as an anthropologist way back when, maybe 30 years ago, called Internal Colonialism, based from a European's perspective, where the Scotch, the Irish, the Welsh were considered internal colonies, the same way Sicily was an internal colony.
that's right.
But also Appalachia was an internal colony of the United States, and the West has been an internal colony for wealthy people to. I mean, we have our pockets of, and it's Linda, you would love reading that book. You would really love just studying that. But that's the notion. It has a name. It's called internal colonialism.
Internal
How
colonialism. Yeah,
exploiting the resources and the people of to export out. Um, so when you look at the far west, most of the resources that are there, mining and cattle, are all used to export out of the region,
that's right.
benefiting the people that were indigenous to the region.
That's right. Now, part of this is also the northern areas. There could be lumber that they wanted to go, but lumber was actually already, there was a lot of lumber in the northern part of the country to begin with. So you're right. It's all those mining opportunities, huge cattle ranches. So the exporting of beef in the west of the Mississippi, cattle are primarily raised for beef production, not for dairy production. So that's what they were looking for out here. What can we get? What can we bring? What can we take and all that? And they needed to be able to move that. And think about how long it took to travel by a horse-drawn carriage or whatever. So stagecoaches, might have existed, but they weren't very fast. They needed those rail lines. And so the rail lines had to come through and find their way over the mountains and all that to reach this westernmost coastline.
And the same thing with Texas oil
Yeah,
and
Texas down here, the
Oklahoma
oil.
oil, and that whole middle part of, the oil areas of the
Yeah,
middle part of the country. Yeah.
yep. And so now that kind of again, from a tension management perspective, that was a very different energy. So it was the energy of people who wanted to be the explorers, who wanted to have the land, whatever they were made them trek this far west. But then, oh no, now we come along with the people who wanted to conquer. And whether they were conquering it economically, and you guys have watched shows like Little House on the Prairie and things like that, where you'd learn about
Mhm.
these little towns that were built up, and word would come that the rail line was coming close by. What could they do to get the rail line to change its route just enough so that that little town could become on the rail line? That would open up all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of opportunities for them in that. And then the 11th nation, I don't know why it's yeah, it's the 11th, 10th. See, they labeled these wrong. 10th should actually be the far west, and 11th should be the left coast. because what they've shown here in the diagram, what they've done here are not the same. But it would make sense that the left coast would have come along last. And these are people who wanted to basically create a world appreciating the natural beauty of these areas. If you've not visited the Pacific Northwest, all this coastal area, it is beautiful. The resources are very unique, and it's certainly something that feels a little bit more as it originally was. Not to suggest that there isn't industry that's happening up here along the coastlines in Portland or um, Washington, San Francisco, all along these areas, but there's definitely a different mindset that
Mhm.
The
exists.
culture of the left coast, from what I understand from reading him and reading other things, is that this is most similar to the Northeast
Yep.
as a culture.
That's right.
So the values and it's like, there's a whole transplant of cultural values that you see on the left coast but they're freer. They're
Yes.
less constricted, they're freer, they're more expansive, they're more far thinking, it's the more innovative than the East
Little
Coast.
space.
Wow.
They are more spread out here, but you are right. The appreciation for higher education that you find up here in this northeastern area of the country is also found over here on the left coast. And this appreciation for caring about one another and supporting
Mhm.
things at the community level, you find that over here on the left coast. So
That explains a lot for me. Because, like I said, when I first came to the United States, I lived in California, I lived in Seattle, but I
mhm.
also love New England,
Yep.
Connecticut in particular.
Yep.
So, and I always felt at home there
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
those areas for some reason. Like it was a welcoming kind of thing. Whereas I said here in the Washington, D.C. area, I can sense the tension. Like I
Yeah.
can feel it.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's palpable for me. This
Yeah.
explains a
As, as
lot.
as a Connecticut person, Brian, I feel very at home in the West Coast,
Yep.
the far West.
Exactly.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're in a whole different cultural world where you live now,
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're kind of like, I don't even know if it falls into Yankeedom anymore. Maybe it's become its own thing. Um,
It's
I
probably
don't,
become its
I'd love to.
own thing with that whole identifier of this swamp, that attitude. Seems like that's something, I don't know where it comes from, but it seemed like that's the thing that plays out the most here.
Well,
Is
that's
Right, right, right.
Tidewater. It's Tidewater. I mean,
Tidewater.
you're living in
ah,
Yeah,
okay.
Tidewater. And it's interesting too, because if you think about the demographics of Washington, D.C., it has a very large Black population.
Mm-hmm.
And so on the one hand, if people don't really understand that Washington D.C. as a place, they think, oh, it's just Capitol Hill. It's just a bunch of,
Right.
politicians and a bunch of embassies and all that. It's kind of like, no,
Well,
Yeah.
what's interesting is that it's not a state, and
not
it's
a state.
Right.
not being given the power that it deserves, partially because it's mostly Black.
Oh, isn't that
Mm.
interesting? Because the other explanation I've heard is that it's because there's no room on the flag for another star.
Yeah, I don't think that's it, because we always can find a way to make room,
You can
That's one of
always,
the
yeah.
things that the League of Women Voters have been working on for decades is um, getting Washington.
Yes, yes,
Well,
exactly.
it's also, talking about that, for how long has Puerto Rico been
The
pursued
two
as
of them,
becoming a state?
yeah.
And Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, has wanted to separate from the Lower Peninsula for as long as I've been alive. But and the government is all in the Lower Peninsula. They basically say, well, if you can show that you can be totally independent, well, it's not like Michigan wants you all that much. So it's just interesting. That's always been the big excuse. There's no room on the flag for more stars. So
Wow. Like that's serious? That's
it's said as
serious?
a joke. I mean, obviously they redesign it. I mean, good grief. Um, Now there's plenty of room there. They take those four there. There's four lines of stars on the flag that have one star less than the other lines. Okay, fine. So there's room for four more at the very least. So yeah, I don't know. I'd have to take a
Wow.
look at it. I could redesign it. No worries about it. So there's room. But anyway, but my point is I wanted to just bring this up just to say that it's interesting that we have to also understand this Western migration and recognize from a tension management perspective, there was another dynamic going on energetically between the people that were willing to explore, willing or driven for whatever reason to move west, and those who decided to stay put. So
Mm.
there's a very
So
big difference. Yeah.
I'd love to throw something out here. So would you say that from a tension management standpoint, the migration west was all about moving from power stress, either power apathy or power stress into power?
Well, I think I'm
Mm.
glad you brought that up because this is what I really want our call next Tuesday to focus on. So I'm going to give you guys this as little seed things to be thinking about.
Okay.
From a tension management perspective, people that are in power apathy or in apathy stayed put. Unless they were dragged by somebody, power apathy and apathy have no reason to move. Even Southern
Mhm.
power is not all that energized. So it's going to be the people that are in power, power stress, and stress who moved. Now, the people that were up in stress have a very different set of motivators for moving to the
Mhm.
west or expanding this territory than the people that are in power stress have, and certainly the people that are in upper power. And so the dialogue I'd like to have on Tuesday is a little bit more about what's going on energetically with that. But on Thursday, we'll pick up with this, finish our discussion around this, but talk as much as we can about how did tension management play out in this whole dynamic. Because we know this tension management is always in play. The only
Mhm.
question is how is it in play as this migration has definitely occurred.
This is
Okay.
so awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Good. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. So have yourself a lovely weekend, and we'll talk again next Thursday. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye
Thanks,
for
Kathy.
now.
Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.